It is a not-for-profit initiative of GMR Foundation. It is our endeavor to continue the tradition of creating and awareness and learning on family governance. The purpose of this session is to provide a platform, impart the latest knowledge to explore and understand aspects that leverage the best of both family and business. The previous series of 7 sessions witnessed more than 300 attendants with a participant from over 15 countries, with 86% of the attendants rating the session as very good and excellent. In today's session, I'm delighted to welcome Mr. David Verdiger, a family enterprise advisor, providing practical and appropriate solution, especially for high net worth families. As a published best-selling author of Transition, he has assisted many high net worth families to navigate the complexity of the succession planning, intergenerational wealth transition, and family governance. David's background as a second-generation family member is 30 years as a tech entrepreneur, together with a confidential and empathetic relational approach to the challenges of family-related business issues, has allowed him to facilitate unique solutions for clients by tapping into his personal knowledge and strategic thinking. Mr. David is also an adjacent industry fellow, that is entrepreneurship, at Swinburne University, and a regular speaker at conference events around the world. Mr. David is married with 5 children, and he has 5 children, and deeply engaged with the local community to a number of non-profit organizations. He is writing his second book about the challenges of the modern, always connected digital world. In between all that, he is fascinated about sports. On behalf of me, on behalf of all our participants, I'm welcoming Mr. David for this. And thank you very much for participating, sir. See, Tatma Dixit is a well-known family business advisor and a spiritual leader who works with the family business across the world, is internationally recognized for his knowledge and application of the wisdom of the Vedas. He was awarded the Maharshi Badrayan Vyas Samman, the highest civil award in 2007 by the President of India for his work on the synergy between modernity and tradition. He is the founder and the chairman of Family Business Research International Center that offers family business advisory services and coaching to family business entrepreneurs and next generation leaders. He is also a board member of Parampara Family Business Institute. Sri Dixit has co-authored the book titled Indian Family Business Mantras with Mr. Peter Leach. On behalf of me, on behalf of the delegate, the welcoming Sri Dixit ji, my pranam, sir.
Thank you, sir.
In today's interesting conversation between Mr. David and Mr. Tatma Dixit, we hope to gain insight on the importance of the communication in family business. The topic of our session is communication and continuity. People always say family must be 3 things is there: communication. It's a very important subject today. Communication, trust, and harmony. These factors can combine in a powerful way, can give family business a competitive advantage. However, the same forces can result in an unbalanced and problematic atmosphere within the family and the business. Toxic communication patterns, perpetual issues, and the complexity brought about by the multiple hats in the family, business, and ownership circle can threaten the continuity of the family company. Today, we'll discuss the various complexities, risks, and practical insight to build and manage effective communication in business families through the real-time experience of Mr. David. I hope that Parampara Family Business Institute, with this online symposium and curated sessions by globally renowned experts on the subject, will benefit established and upcoming family business. I wish you enjoy the learning session today. It is very, very important session. Guruji, I will be 2 minutes. I will be in the office with 2 minutes. Sorry for my this one, sir. I stopped the car next to this. Sorry for this. I'm welcoming all the delegates for this session. It's a very important topic. The topic today, communication is very important. Namaste, Andy.
Namaste, sir. Thank you so much, Chairman. Just like in real estate industry, we look for 3 most important things for the real estate industry to be successful. We call it as location, location, location. Similarly, in the family business field, there are 3 most important things we need to focus on. It's called communication, communication, and communication. I'm really excited to have conversation with David and looking forward to have a dialogue on such a relevant topic which cuts across all the cultures, all the different types of family businesses. And dear participants, I hope you will enjoy our conversation. Please keep your paper and pen ready with you to make notes of various insights which may come out of our conversation. And whatever the questions you have, please post it in our Q&A section. We will try to incorporate our dialogue while we are talking. Your questions we will try to address and we will provide an answer for it. David, thank you so much once again. Request you to share your insights, your beliefs about the very concept of communication in the field of family business. Over to you. We are all waiting to hear from you. Thank you.
Namaste, and thanks very much, Dikshitji. Thank you for inviting me to speak on this platform. I think I've looked into PFBI, and the work you do is really important. And family business in India is massive. In fact, I discovered a lot of businesses are started through entrepreneurship, and my background is as an entrepreneur. I've studied entrepreneurship and working with family businesses. And India ranks one of the highest in the world in something called necessity motives for family entrepreneurs. So there's a lot of people in India who are motivated to start businesses that become family businesses. And what you're doing at PFBI is really important in helping these businesses learn best practice. So I really commend you, and I'm very pleased to be here tonight for me. So communication, one of my favorite topics. I love passionate about family businesses. And, when I work with families, a lot of the work that I do, I say, what is the foundation? The foundation is that a family should have a sense of shared values and purpose. On one hand, you say, okay, that's the starting point. We build governance and other things over the top of that. But really, what you actually need before that is you need the ability to communicate. And if you think about a family business or a business, because no business starts as a family business, or very few. It starts with an entrepreneur, and an entrepreneur says, I'm going to start a business. I've got an idea. I see a problem that I want to solve. And so the understanding the psychology of the entrepreneur, they're driven by a desire to build, to create wealth, to create something of value. And then eventually that may become the seed of a family business. But when you're a business founder, you don't need to communicate with very many people. You do everything. I started businesses and I started them from scratch. And, when you're starting a business, you do everything. You don't have meetings. You don't make, how do you make decisions? Who do you consult? I consult myself. I'm communicating with myself. I don't need to sit around a board table when I'm a small business that's in its infancy. Of course, as the business grows, you employ people and that drives the growth of the business. But then the interesting stuff happens when you bring in other family members. And when you bring in other family members, they are people who may not be owners now, but they might be future owners of the business. And as soon as you've got that situation where you have multiple people in a family, so it starts with the founder, but then you've got the founder's children, uncles, other family members, the importance of communication is paramount. Decisions, how are decisions made? You can't decide yourself. You've got other stakeholders at the table, and therefore it's so important to communicate with them and to make sure that everybody's on the same page. You might have different divisions within the business, or as you're delegating authority, you need a clear understanding of that relationship of who's responsible for what. Otherwise, you're going to step on each other's toes. And then the other thing you've got in families, which we'll talk about, is this notion of three hats or three circles. So some of you may be familiar with something called the three circles of a family, business, and ownership. And when you've got these three hats, you are naturally conflicted. So one of my favorite stories is the one about the father who owns the family business, and he calls in his son and he says, look, unfortunately, you're really not performing well in the business. You're not delivering what needs to happen. And the business has got to let you go. And then the father comes out from behind his desk and sits next to the son and puts his arm around you. And he says, as your father, I understand you've lost your job. How can I help?
Absolutely.
And it's a great story because it illustrates this notion of, when he's sacking him, they're sitting on opposite sides of the desk, and he is a boss and he's an employee. But at the same time, it's his father and his son. And he's saying, I have to make a business decision. And for the sake of the business, I've got to let you go. That's awful. And it was a terrible decision for me. And I want to acknowledge that and now say, now I'm going to take off my boss hat and I'm going to wear my father hat. And as a father, son, how can I help? I couldn't help you as your boss to keep your job, but I can help you as a father. How can I help? And this illustrates the inherent conflict of interest that you've got in any family business. Some people might be owners and working in the business. Some people might be owners and not working in the business. You might have people who are working in the business and are not owners. You're non-family executives. And this three-circle model allows you to understand the different positions people are in with respect to the family business and how this drives the decisions they make. And because they're making those decisions wearing these three different hats, that's where businesses can get into trouble if they're not communicating well.
David, just some question. I mean, it's very interesting what you just shared is that, they start with one person. Always every family business starts with a founder. And over a period of time, there are many other family members join. That's when the need to communicate starts. In our culture, and I guess in all over the world, there is no, right from childhood, the communication as a subject is never taught. Psychology and our understanding a human being, if you cannot communicate unless you understand another human being, a fellow human being, your family member, a non-family member, anybody, but it's never there in a structured way, you are going to learn something. So based on your experience, it will be interesting to hear from you. Why do you feel communication is such a big challenge in a families?
So communicating in families is very difficult, particularly between generations. So, you take the scenario of the patriarch of the family, and so often in families, it is a male, so I'll use that term. And when they're starting to talk about sensitive issues like, father, you're getting old, you want to hand over things to the business. These are very uncomfortable discussions. And the reason they're so uncomfortable is because it forces the older generation to confront their mortality. And nobody wants to talk about death. And it's very strange because death is actually the only certain thing in life. Everybody dies. Last time I checked, nobody's been able to cheat that system. But here's the thing. If you think about what are the attributes of an entrepreneur, the attributes of a business founder, they are determined. They have a lot of self-belief. They have the experience of being able to do everything. I remember for me as an entrepreneur, the hardest thing was I hired somebody because, I knew that I couldn't do everything. I needed somebody to do something. And that person, I looked at everything they did and I said, I can do it better than you. And it bothered me immensely because they weren't being able to do their job as well as I could. And then I sat back and I thought, well, hang on, I can't be in two places at once. I haven't yet invented a machine to clone myself. So I have to accept that other people are going to do things. And they're not going to do them as well as I can. But because there's only one of me and we need, a handful of people, we need other people. So that entrepreneur in a person says, I can do anything. I've started a business from nothing. I've created, I'm unflappable. I'm indestructible. And that's the belief of entrepreneurs. And to say to somebody, hey, let's talk about what happens when you're no longer here. What? I'm going somewhere? What do you think? Absolutely. I started this business. I'm not going anywhere. Let's not talk about it. So that's something that makes these discussions very uncomfortable for people. And you've got younger members of the family, and they are ambitious, and they've seen their father, other older family members succeed, and they say, well, I'm 30 now, I know everything. I want to be CEO. I want to rise up through the family business, and that can be perceived as a threat. I mean, the other thing, Dixit Ji, we talk about is culture. Mm. The importance of cultural overlays in families, and
different cultures have a different norms of how actually they communicate.
Exactly.
So overall, I mean, if you look at India, David, India is a hierarchical society, like most of the world. It's a very patriarchal, hierarchical society, and the norms of communication in India, suppose a son has to speak to the father, they have to, if you are not speaking with respect, it is being seen as it's not something which is okay. So the communication breakdown takes place. So you cannot transition from parent to child to adult conversation at all. How much ever old you become, you may be 60-year-old, but when you are talking to your father, you are still a child in his mind. What is some of your experience? It will be interesting to hear. You are from a different part of the world in terms of the cultural implication on the communication.
Yep.
Some anecdotal example will be extremely nice to hear.
Yes. So what you said is so true. So imagine a family business, and they're sitting around the table, and you have the father and you have, say, a son and a daughter. Okay. And let's say the son is the youngest in the family. So birth order in families is really, really important. I know in my family, we've sat around the table, and I'm the youngest of 5. We've sat around the table and I've said something, and people look at me and they say, that family dynamic is very hard to escape, because it's there with you from when you were born into that family. You've got that, this is the oldest, the youngest has to respect the oldest, and everybody has to respect the parents. And so in a business context where, let's say you employ somebody with similar skills, you would look at whatever they say completely differently. But when you have that family overlay, suddenly you have that bias. Then you take along the cultural, okay? So in Australian culture, we are very open, and we say what we need to say, no BS. In Indian culture and Asian cultures, that you have that respect, you can't contradict your father to his face. I'm Jewish, again, Jewish culture, very respectful to the previous generation. In fact, there are opinions under Jewish law that you are not allowed to contradict your father. That is considered disrespectful. And a fascinating example of this is from Malcolm Gladwell, where he talks about there was a spate of air crashes in Korea. And what he put it down to was the culture in the cockpit. So picture the culture in the cockpit, okay? And let's say it was an American airline, and the co-pilot notices something's wrong. He would be screaming and swearing at the pilot, saying, quick, we need to do something about this. And the pilot would respond, and they would solve the problem. But if you take this to the Korean culture, what was happening was something was going wrong on the flight. And the co-pilot says to the pilot, please, honorable pilot, may I direct your attention to such and such, this reading? And, the sense of urgency that was needed in an aeroplane, which is a life and death situation, is being affected by the culture. And until they realized what was going on and they trained the pilots to say, in this context, it is okay to speak your mind because lives are at risk. So in the family business, and families need to go through change. And particularly as a family, as a business has to evolve, it has to do regularly strategic renewal. Strategic renewal is so important. And you can have a situation in a family business where the father's saying, I've been doing this for 50 years and it's been going fine. Why should I change? And the son, who might be well educated or more across the particular industries and the external forces that are a potential threat to the business, the son might say, Father, with respect, okay? And it has to be done with respect. You can't be rude. There's no need to be rude. In Australia, around the board of meeting rooms, people might be rude to each other, but you don't have to be rude to be assertive and to get a point across. It can be done respectfully, and this is a skill that can be learned, to communicate in a way that is respectful to elders, but at the same time get the point across. And in family businesses, for family businesses to really last, for any business to last, it has to do regular strategy. So many family businesses don't do this, and this is a real threat to any family business. Any other business, every 5 years we do strategy, do another 5-year plan or rolling 5-year plans. Family businesses, you suffer from inertia. We've got success, we've been doing it this way for a long time. Why don't we continue? And that is a barrier to the not just to the relationships, but also to the business. For a business to thrive, it needs open communication.
Some thought when we are talking about open communication, what are the prerequisite for any individual, in your experience, you feel that are essential for them to communicate well?
So it's so important for people to have something called self-awareness, because everybody thinks communication is about what I say. It's not. It's I'll tell you, I happen to be I do a lot of different things, but one of the things I do, I happen to be a professional voice artist. And
professional?
A professional voice artist. So I do narrations, corporate videos, those sorts of things.
Okay.
And I got some training in this from a professional. And after I got some training, I went out and said, I'm going to find myself an agent. And I found something that said, what are the 3 most important things that you need to be a successful voice artist? And everybody would say, what's the number 1? Your voice. Okay, I've got a nice deep voice, No. What's the most important thing? Self-awareness, the brain, the ability to hear yourself and to take direction. So self-awareness is really important, but the other most important thing to do in communicating is to listen. Because communication is not a one-way street. By definition, if I'm talking to myself, but if I need to communicate with you, that means there's an exchange of something between us. Something has got to get from inside my head to inside your head to the point where you accept it. So one of the things people can do is learn a technique known as active listening. And it's, I did a course on negotiation years ago. And part of the course was talking about communication, because any negotiation involves communication. You need to get a sense, if you're negotiating, what you're aiming to do is reach an outcome, convince another person of your position or reach a position that's acceptable to both parties. So, the basis to be able to negotiate is to be able to communicate well. And to communicate well, something called active listening is a very important skill, where you're listening to the other person and in what's called an active way. So if we think about, how can I become a better communicator? It's not all about me and what I say. It's about listening to the other person and making sure that you understand what the other person is saying and you convey that to the other person.
Yeah, this is quite interesting. I have a core belief, David, is, if self-awareness is absolutely essential. That brings in thought clarity. If you don't have a self-awareness, you don't even know what you want to communicate. And yes, as the second point, what you mentioned is active listening to what the other person is doing. But before that, I have a question. My core belief is, if I have to communicate with somebody, there is a prerequisite called I need to have a good relationship with them, especially in a family business context. Okay, there is a transactional communication, there is a deep fundamental communication. And when we are talking about family business communication within the families, if I don't have a deep relationship, how will I communicate? It's okay to have a self-awareness. It's okay to have an active listening skills. And I believe that if you are not going to invest enough in relationship, that precedes, you need to somehow start, that's how in many family businesses, I feel, because there's no relationship, deeper relationship, what is holding them together is the business, not the personal connect. They start avoiding communicating with each other. Difficult subjects are never spoken. What do you think are difficult if you don't communicate important topics? What are the risks of avoiding communication? What do you think?
Yeah, and this is very important, because when communication gets difficult, what is our response? Our response is not to blow up and have an angry discussion. It's to have no discussion. So what we have to think about is, what are the risks of not communicating? So everybody says, well, the risk, I don't want to have a communication with them. I don't want to talk about this because we're just going to fight. So what do I do instead? Nothing. So what happens? Well, what happens if you have if you have a sore on your hand and you put a Band-Aid on it? What can happen is it can fester and it can get infected. And so the longer you leave a situation that is brooding and let it fester, the worse it gets. But here's the thing about communication. One thing that goes hand in hand with communication is trust. So in a family, where things are open, that leads to trust. It's better to understand where they're closed, have at least a lack of trust. So, a family situation, the child says to the father, ask them a question, and the father says, you don't need to know that. Where people deflect and say, refuse to communicate or refuse to be open, that leads to the other person thinking, what are they hiding? Is there something wrong? The son is expressing concern about some aspect of the business, and the father says, you don't have to worry about that. But I am worried about it. I've asked you for a reason. Please respect me and answer. And so what that leads to is a loss of trust. You don't trust me? I know this family, they had started having family meetings, and they gave all of the family members a briefing document at the meeting. And at the end of the meeting, one of the family members says, oh, can I take this home? They said, no, you can't. What do you mean? You're giving it to me. Nope, it doesn't leave the room. Sorry, you can't take it. Now, what message does that send to the person? Okay, you've got, I don't trust you. I don't trust you with this. This is too important. So as soon as you've got that lack of trust, it can spiral down into, what are they, what are they hiding? And then if there's a lack of information, what do people do? What they do is they make assumptions. Mm-hmm. Okay, you haven't told me this. I'm going to guess the answer myself. Now, when I guess the answer, how am I going to do that? Am I going to do that with a positive outlook or a negative outlook? Well, you don't trust me. You haven't told me the answer. I'm going to assume the worst. Okay, so these are the sorts of things that happen when there's a lack of communication, lack of trust, and assumptions, and negative assumptions.
Negative assumptions, right?
Negative assumptions, and negative assumptions are one of the worst things. We make negative assumptions. We always make assumptions about anything we don't know. The question is, are we going to make a positive one or a negative one? And based on our experience with the other person, if we trust that other person, we'll make a positive assumption. You know, oh, they didn't tell me because, you know, somebody else is responsible for it and they don't want to step on their toes or whatever. If you trust the person, then you'll make positive assumptions. If you don't trust the person, you'll make negative assumptions.
So
And
along with the prerequisite on relationship, trust becomes one more prerequisite here.
correct. Trust and communication go hand in hand. The more communication, the more trust. The less communication, the less trust. And it's like it's either a vicious cycle or a virtuous cycle.
Yeah.
Yep.
Depending on where you are starting.
Correct.
You want to start with the trust or you want to start with the communication. You know, what is your experience dealing with multi-generational families? You know, families goes through transition, especially family businesses. They go through a generational transition, one generation to another generation to another generation. And each generation communicates differently. Their definition of communication seems to be very, very different. You know, how do we learn in terms of how are we going to focus on understanding each other's language? Because, you know, especially if we look at Indian family businesses, their third generation, second generation, third generation, they are all being educated in the West, many of them. And they seem to be speaking some other language altogether. How do we decode their mental language? Because that's one of the area I experience a lot of communication breakdown between generations. They don't seem to understand each other's language. What has been your experience around this area?
Yep, it's absolutely right. And you know, the differences between generations have been around for as long as there have been generations. And the reason is that a person is a product of nature and nurture. We are a product. We form our values and our beliefs in our formative years, in our, you know, up to teenage years. And we are influenced by the things that are going on in the world around us during that time. So somebody who had these formative experiences 40 years ago, as opposed to 20 years ago, will be formed by different things, and therefore they will have different attitudes and values. And that is the basis for the generation gap. And, you know, everybody complains about baby boomers and millennials and those are stereotypes, and sometimes they're generalizations. But the fact is that there are differences between the way the family members look at the world. So the question is, how do you bridge that? And you bridge that by bringing it into the awareness, okay? Because these differences between generations, they are so deep inside us, we don't recognize them. So there are things that families can do across generations, exercises. In fact, I think there's one in the workbook of the first chapter of my book, understanding that link between those formative experiences, between those experiences in our formative years and our values. And I've done this exercise with multiple generations, and it just opens their eyes saying, wow, something that was obvious to me, I thought it would be obvious to you too. But the reason it was obvious to them is because of something that happened 50 years ago that this person never experienced in the same way. So bringing that generational difference into the understanding and into the consciousness is a great way to help understand. Now, it's funny, you mentioned, again, Western educated, and this is particularly an issue in Asia. You know, you look at these, what was that Crazy Rich Asians movie? You know, everybody sends their children to get the best education. We're going to send you to Harvard to get an MBA or to Oxford. And then they come back, and as you say, they're suddenly speaking a different language. They're talking management speak. And the father says, you know, this is what I spent tens of thousands of dollars for. So my son talks to me like an alien from outer space. So this is very important to bridge that communication gap. And one way for families to do it is to have externals. To have external people at the table can help bridge that gap in communication and make sure that every voice is heard for what it's heard. And as you said, communication is a two-way street. You know, you might get your fancy MBA, but if you don't also learn how you have to moderate that voice, that thing that you've been taught, so that your own culture is able to accept it, you've only learned half the lesson. So half of what you're taught is the knowledge. The other half is how to integrate that knowledge, integrate that into your home culture, into your home environment. So that's very important. And as I said, communication is a two-way street. You know, the person with the fancy MBA will say, I know everything now. Why aren't you listening to me, Dad? And so, you know, it's not the father's job to get to the level of the son. It's not the son's job to get to the level of the father. It's the two of them to find that meeting point in the middle where we respect our differences and understand them. And we go in there and say, okay, this is what I learned. This is what you've done for 50 years very successfully. And you know, I respect that. How can we find a way to take the best of both worlds? And that's, you know, I say it's very simple to say it, but that's the hardest thing.
You know, just building on this, I find in my experience with many Indian families, especially the joint family businesses who are living together, you know, it's some families are quite enmeshed families. And many a time, I'm actually not speaking my voice to you. Maybe I am speaking somebody else's voice to you. I am just a medium. It's a triangulation. I'm actually doing a triangulation.
Okay, I thought that's what you were. Yep.
I'm actually doing a triangulation, but the other person may not have a wisdom to understand where exactly it's come from. You know, what has been your experience vis-a-vis this triangular communication? Because especially in a joint family ecosystem in India, when a next generation gets married, their spouse have a huge impact on their thinking, their feeling, and their communication, and continuously this crisscross keeps going on. We don't speak for ourselves, we speak for somebody else in the room. How do you handle that? What is your insight on this triangular communication? This is in India.
Yep. So triangles is very important in family communication and family systems theory. It's a whole science unto itself. But I think what you're alluding to is the people who aren't in the room, the in-law children, and you know, and that again is very important influence in the families, and families. Every family has different rules. So you know, and this is a cultural thing. So in some families they allow in-law children at the table. At some families they allow them to have jobs. At some families they don't either. And you know, and I've got a saying: you can join a family by birth and marriage, and you leave a family by death or divorce. So you know, if you're born into a family, you are in the family. You are a family member until the day you die. You can't divorce your family. On the other hand, in-laws. So first of all, you've got two issues. You've got first of all the issue of in-law children. Okay, if you employ a son-in-law, a daughter-in-law in a business, then you don't trust them the same way you trust your own child necessarily, first of all. Second of all, if that marriage breaks down, what happens? You've gone from somebody who you know, is not just a part of the family, but also part of the business. Now they're no longer part, they're leaving the family, but they're still in the business. And for this reason, a lot of families say, no, we're not going to do it. you know, I have a rule in family business, or in all business: don't hire whom you can't fire. So whenever you take anybody on in a business, child-in-law, or non-family member, always think of the exit strategy. If it ever came to it, what would be the circumstances where this person would need to leave? And how would we handle it? You don't have to develop a whole complex plan, but just have a think about it. You know, if it ever happened, how would we think about it? And how might we approach it? And it might lead to the decision to say, it's going to be too hard, I won't even start. But then the other thing you say is, the other aspect to in-laws is that person who isn't in the room, where the child, under the influence of their spouse, it's actually the spouse who's speaking. You know, I need a new car. Our house isn't big enough. These are the things that happen around the family table discussion, and you know that's not them talking, that's their wife.
Yeah, that's true. You know, just to add here, David, is I find a concept very interesting. I have coined called communication from bedroom to boardroom. This is very prevalent in different parts of the world, more so specifically in India.
Yes.
And it's you never understand that how this communication silently transitions from a boardroom to the bedroom. Do you have any experience dealing with such interesting families?
Yes. So Bedroom to Boardroom is the book by Jackie Fury from Sydney. I'm not sure if that's what you were referring to, but she's a family systems therapist.
Okay.
And again, we're talking about family systems, and a family is a system, and that means it's interlocking pieces that are connecting in various ways. And yes, you know, pillow talk, or the stuff that happens in each family's private home. And again, this is something that you have in India, which you don't have in Australia, where you have multiple generations living in the same household. But even if you don't, you still have those, you know, bedroom to boardroom situations. And, you know, my view is every child, here's the principle: every child is born into a different family. Okay. So a family have a child, the family adjusts, then they might have another child, they make another adjustment, another child. Those children who are born into the family, culturally, their influence, the family culture influences them, because they're brought up as children and they grow into that culture. If you contrast that with somebody who marries in, they're coming with their culture as an adult into the family system. And that can be very disruptive. In my family, my wife and I have 5 children, and 3 of them got married in the space of 5 years. Suddenly we had 3 new family members.
Wow. And
they come from different cultures. And what's required is a process of cultural absorption.
Mm-hmm.
And it's important to recognize that they're adults and they come with different values, with different cultures to the rest of the family, and that can lead to a cultural clash. Again, it's a process of recognizing that difference and acknowledging it, that any family by definition starts with 2 people. And those 2 people come from different cultures. So the family that you were born in, the family that I was born in, came from my father and mother. They came from different cultures. In the same way, when my children marry, they bring somebody else from a different culture. So that's part of the process of marriage, and families need to acknowledge that and develop those communication tools within the family to accept that their grandchildren are going to be influenced by 2 sides, just like they were influenced by 2 sides.
That is true. And especially in India, David, just for your awareness, most of the children are influenced by their maternal side.
Mm-hmm.
Because there's a culture prevalent in India, in ancient India also. During the summer holidays, the mother used to take their children to their parents' house. That is one. The biggest influence comes, most of the children in India are born in their mother's house, not in their father's house. So the moment the mother is pregnant, she goes to her parents' house, and the child is born in the parents' house, and they come back after about 5 or 6 months after settling down. So the first set of influence, culture, communication gets embedded in the child's mind, which comes from the maternal side. It's still a very, very prevalent practice in India, cultural practice in India. So audience, I would request if anyone is interested to post their questions in the Q&A section while we continue our conversation. David, if we have to institutionalize the communication as a core theme or a core philosophy in a family, what are some of the practices or what are some of the code of conduct? If we have to give a code of conduct around communication, what do you think we can do? What can we establish which helps in building the communication as an institution? And it is not a need-based. Also, how do I transition from, as part of this institutionalizing, how do I transition from head level communication to heart level communication? Because that's where the purity sits. The rest is just a transaction.
Yep. So let's talk about a code of conduct, because that's really, really important. And, it sounds very formal to speak of something like a code of conduct in a family. It's like, we're a family, we don't need these codes. But again, the problem in families is there's so much that's not said. All of the assumptions, all of the hidden biases, all of the views of different family members and what boxes we put them into. And a code of conduct, doesn't have to be, a lot of people say, we're not that professional or we're not that big, we don't need that sort of thing. It's something that any family can benefit from. And so I was working with this family, and it was 2 sisters in a family business, and they were found, the father had already stepped back and the 2 of them were running it. And they were really struggling with some of the communication and the emotion in it. And what we did was we developed a code of conduct, but the preceding thing was we articulated their shared values. Mm-hmm. Because a lot of people say, I think this, I think that. We have family values that we can all say, okay, these are the things that we all have in common. Let's sit down and understand what they are. And then here's the important thing about the code of conduct. We draw a line from any of the principles in the code of conduct back to the values. So we say, we have a rule, okay? We have a rule that of respectful communication. Why do we have respectful communication? Because that's based on our values. So we have a rule in the meeting that nobody interrupts anybody. You always let somebody finish what they have to say before you speak up. That can be a code of conduct, a meeting rule that we do. And, and that sort of rule, it can deflate anger. It's very useful for those sorts of things. But the important thing about these rules is they shouldn't be arbitrary. If they're based on values, then everybody can understand why. Why are we doing this? Why are we making these business decisions? And I'm very big on shared values as a principle in governance, because my view is that family members should always be able to challenge things. Why are we doing this? Why have we made this decision? And if it's something that you can point to your values and say, I'm making this decision because these are our family values, then that is a far stronger reason to really understand why we're implementing this code of conduct. And the code of conduct doesn't have to be, overly prescriptive, and it can evolve as well. It should be reviewed on a regular basis.
David, one of the key challenge after the invention of WhatsApp, one of the key problem is in family meetings, or generally in families, while family members are trying to sit and talk to each other, they are parallelly sitting and chatting with somebody else. And it is very important to tell them that, look, till you stop your WhatsApp chat, I will wait. And the question comes from some family members, but you came in later. I was actually already chatting. How do you break this kind of because this WhatsApp has done a disaster to the family communication in a very big way. Technology, basically, all the time being hooked to WhatsApp, Insta, etc. No, do you have any insights, a quick insight for families? Because I see family members in the boardroom meetings, the senior generation or a junior generation requesting. And with this invention, there's one more problem which has come in: attention deficiency syndrome. Some people keep playing the game on the mobile all the time just to keep their attention on. How do you communicate with them? How, and this, nobody wants to adapt to this concept called any code of conduct. Keep the phone out. How do you deal with it?
It's very funny that you asked that, because that's actually the one of the subjects I examine in my next book that I'm writing. So I'm very passionate about that. And also, I'll say I'm guilty of sitting in meetings and looking at WhatsApp and playing games to occupy my brain that needs stimulus. But these sorts of things, it's about being present at a meeting. This is nothing to do with family. WhatsApp is and this attention deficit, or something is called continuous partial attention, where we're not being present. So learning to be present at a meeting, whether it's a meeting, whether it's the dinner table. I know, that some people have this rule. They all go to the restaurant, everybody stacks up the phones in the middle of the table, and whoever takes their phone first has to pay for everybody's dinner.
Wow. That's interesting.
But think about it, okay? I'm guilty of this myself, but say to somebody, you're looking at your phone. So are you a brain surgeon on call? If you're not, put your phone away, put it in a basket.
Yep.
When you come into the meeting, and that's something where asking people simply to be present at a meeting is not asking too much. I want all of you at the meeting. And this is it's a good communication practice, and it's unfortunate that technology invades our personal space to this extent.
That is true. Being present is very important. A couple of questions have come in, David. How the family governance dimension fit into the framework of communication and continuity?
Yeah, and of course, it's a great question, and they're all very much tied together, because when we're talking about family governance, okay, so this is that layer of the family. That sets the rules. This is how we do things in our family, and this is what I do with families: help them establish this governance, and it's only important in the context of of more than one generation. That's when you have to start developing these family governance principles and policies that that can help families communicate and govern themselves well.
So one more question has come in terms of how do you deal with the maternal influence?
Now I saw that question, and you'd spoken to that. That's something that it's very interesting, because more and more women are getting involved in family business in India, and it's really good to see that. And I have to say,
go ahead.
I have to pass on that one, because I don't think I know enough about Indian culture to really understand that. And that's where
I'll share some insights here. I work with a gentleman, and it's a family business. He has a huge problem with his mother-in-law. So therefore, anything the wife brings in from the mother's house, he has a huge issue, saying that, what, all the time, why are you bringing in your maternal story into our here story? They are very, very particular to guard that whole space. Also one more key topic in India is it's an outdated concept, but if you get married from one house, you don't have anything to do with the father's house. You go to your husband's house. You start living there. It's called changing your surname, changing your gotra, everything changes. But your child belongs to both the houses, and how do you deal with this complex situation? It becomes extremely difficult.
Yeah, and that's exactly what we were saying before, how everybody is born from two parents and they come with their own cultural background. Now, in India, you might have that overlay where people may not marry across certain cultural boundaries or across certain family groups or castes. But these days, those norms, especially as countries in Asia are coming under more Western influence, those cultural norms are being pushed. And, I don't think you can say to somebody these days anymore, you've got to leave your father's house and leave your father's influence. And unfortunately, the person who doesn't like his mother-in-law, what he's actually doing is he's making a negative assumption about anything that comes from his mother-in-law simply because it's from his mother-in-law. Now, it may be, so basically she's better off saying, where's this from? Oh, I don't know, I found it somewhere, oh, this is fantastic, wow, don't tell him that it's his mother-in-law's traditional dish.
That is true. One question has come in saying that some real life example of how lack of organizational vision or a lakshya impacts communication effectiveness. It basically talks about if you don't have a collective purpose.
Yes.
How does it impact the communication? Because when does the communication happen? When you have a common purpose. In families and businesses also, if the communication has to increase, the family members have to do something together. If they don't do something together, it is not possible to increase the communication. What has been your experience, some insights in this area?
Yeah, it's very interesting because a lot of businesses, you bring in somebody and they'll say, we have to do a vision and mission statement. And everybody says, oh, boring. And they look at it very cynically. But in families, in any business, it's important. And in families, it's especially important to articulate those shared values. And because the problem we've got in families is so much that's unstated. And if it's unstated, then people make assumptions about it. If you bring it out into the open, then that facilitates two things. First of all, you understand that you've got a shared purpose. And second of all, as I said before, with the code of conduct and other things, you can draw a line from this particular aspect of the family's purpose or vision to a policy that actually makes more sense. So it means that policies and decisions have a foundation that the family can all agree on. I see the questions are really flying through at the moment.
Yeah, even though we have ran past, we will take a couple of more minutes because some interesting questions are coming. How do you deal with, there are some, when you are conflicted deeply with somebody, during this conflict, how do you deal with communication as a topic? Because you are dealing with sometimes an ideological conflict or a conflict of interest. And, one gentleman has asked a question, how do you treat everybody equally so that you are able to respect them? So it's easy to communicate. But in a hierarchical society, especially in India or worldwide, how do you establish this equality? Any insights from you, David?
This is where having an external person around the table is so important, because the external person brings that external perspective. So around the table, everybody's got that family power hierarchy and that dynamic. The external, sometimes having an external chair even, who's chairing the meeting, that is very helpful to mitigate those things, because we've got to accept you are never going to treat them equally. Don't, you set up an ideal and say, why can't we all treat everybody equally? Sorry, we can't. Don't try to achieve something that's going to be impossible. On the other hand, what we can do is we can seek to mitigate some of those effects of the feelings that are in the room but are unstated And you do that by having an external, because an external person to the family, everybody can say, okay, I all like you or don't like you equally. You're not part of our family. You come for the meeting, you go. You know the family well enough that you can work with the family, and not so well that we can bring in all of our personal biases and history. So those sorts of independence, and I'm not talking about like a formal mediation or anything like that. I'm talking about facilitation. Okay.
That's totally correct. But look at India as a culture. Families are generally very closed. Okay. And they do not want to talk about their private stuff in front of a non-family member. That itself is quite a challenge and taboo. While the concept of in India, if somebody says, you know, I'm doing a therapy, or I'm going to a counselor, or I'm using somebody as a sounding board, what's so wrong with you? What is it which we cannot solve that you want to bring in an outsider? Because the family, the seniors think that, you know, they can solve all their problems of the family.
Yeah.
So it's a bit of a challenge in India to get an outsider in. And that also to establish the trust on that outsider that this person is going to be unbiased. It's quite a bit of a challenge.
It's a huge challenge in those. Yeah. So and this is a cultural issue. So it's a culture of, we don't air our dirty laundry in public. We can solve our problems ourselves. Those sorts of cultures are deeply embedded in a lot of societies, and they often can lead to really, really bad things happening, unfortunately. And, you know, and for families, you know, it's not this overcoming this barrier to say it's okay to need help is really important. If you're not able to do that, I think it's seriously problematic. The question is, perhaps in India in particular, families can look for somebody who is like not a total stranger, but not so close that they can't, but not too close that they can't do the job.
Right.
So perhaps, you know, I have this concept where two families that are friends, somebody from one family will help them and somebody from the other family will help them, where, you know, you can have somebody who's close enough to assume that trusted role, but not too close and not too far to be a stranger. But the other thing to bear in mind, and this is very important, that trust doesn't happen overnight. You know, it can take a long time for that person to become a trusted advisor to the family. So you can't go into a situation expecting that instantly this person can be trusted. So the process of bringing in that external advisor has got to be one that allows the necessary time and steps for that person to increase their trust to appropriate level within the family.
That's true. One interesting question has come. Somebody has asked how to handle communication breakdown in family business. What are the early signs? The answer probably is when you stop. The early signs are when you stop spending quantity time with another family member. That's the sign of, I believe, in the family businesses or in families generally, if the communication has to be good, you need to spend quantity time. I don't believe it has to be the concept of a quality time. You know, we work with one family where the husband used to live in another city, family business. Wife used to live in another city. They say, oh, we catch up once a week. We have spent a quality time on phone 1 hour. And the reflection of that so-called quality time, all the time husband and wife were fighting. What exactly does it mean? So the early sign is if you are not spending a quantity time, there is something you need to wake up. And if your near and dear ones do not want to spend their quality and quantity time with you, with full presence, there is something is wrong. We had an interesting conversation, David. I think there are more questions are coming, but we will try to answer them through emails or we will post it on our website. It was very enriching and some amazing relevant inputs have come from you during this conversation. Just to sum it up, influence of culture on communication, the importance of code of conduct. In a simple way, whatever you can prepare. Don't hire someone you cannot fire. Usually what happens in family, you don't have to hire them. They are part of it. There is an entitlement mindset. So you really can't, you struggle with not hiring. Self-awareness is extremely important, and an active listening. Having an external person on table as and when you need to deal with difficult topics. This is one important point. And whenever there's a generational communication gap, understand the different language and meet them somewhere in the middle. These are all some of the beautiful insights which have come as part of the Parampara Family Business Institute. We keep doing many such seminars just to build awareness. Our founder, Shri GM Rao, is extremely passionate about the concept of family business, because he and I believe any country's backbone is family business. Any country's economy's backbone is family business. And if the family businesses are not going to be successful, it's going to create a huge challenge to the country at large. So in spite of his busy schedule, he has taken time. I call it as manufacturing time. He has so many commitments. He runs a very large business, but when it comes to family business topic, he's very, very passionate, and he commits time. He shares his insights and keeps on sharing these valuable insights so that the families can be together and build lasting, perpetuating families from generation to generation. Thank you, Chairman, for your deeper commitment to this concept. David, thank you so much for your time. I know it's too late for you in Australia, but you have been extremely kind to spare your valuable time to share your insights. We would be very, very happy to share I really love your monthly magazine, Familosophy. The name itself is very exciting. You share so nice insights there. It will be our privilege to share your newsletter on our platform, which can benefit many. And dear audience, thank you so much for your patience listening. I hope you had some valuable insights and inputs during this conversation. Thank you, Chairman. David, would you like to say anything before we close?
Yeah, look, just thanks again for the opportunity, and I really enjoyed it. GM Rao, thank you so much for supporting this initiative. Dixit Ji, I really like that quantity time, because one thing that keeps families together, and I've seen this in a number of families, is when they invest in good shared experiences together. And this is completely separate from the family business. This is talking about the family together. So I think that's something really good to leave everybody with as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Namaste.
Thank you, Andy. Thank you. Wonderful, sir. Thank you very much.
Thank
you very much, sir.
Thank you.
Namaste.
Namaste.